Okay, so let's move on to our next presenter. So we have Isaac Cardin from the U.S. Naval War College, who will talk about the South China Sea, I believe, the maritime boundaries. So, Isaac.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Paul, for facilitating the invite. Very happy to join a different group of specialists than I normally chat with, and I think Paul is right that this is a nice fit. So what I've been working on with Paul is a book called China's Law of the Sea: The New Rules of Maritime Order. It's forthcoming with Yale University Press. And my background is in international relations and in China studies. And the book itself is about China's approach to international law, and particularly the law of the sea. So it takes us beyond the South China Sea. You'll be happy to learn. The maps I'll show you are the Western Pacific, particularly all of China's surrounding maritime periphery. And we worked very hard, Paul and I, to try and figure out a way to spatially and geographically represent this in a way that helps tell the story of the book. And I think it really ends up being an extremely important part of it. And I'm keen to learn as much geography as I can. So it's great to connect with a group of specialists. And I don't have any background in geography, but I've spent a huge proportion of my time over the last 10 years, believe it or not, working on this project, which came out of a dissertation and has been thoroughly destroyed and built back from the ground up. But the constant throughout has been geographic and really thinking in space, which is the title of a piece that I accidentally jumped the gun and put out in the chat, but may be of interest to folks who have both international politics and geospatial interests. And the author of that is a spooky CIA guy who thinks a lot about maps and how they should inform decision making. So I suspect it'll be of interest to you. But at any rate, that's just by way of saying it's fundamental to a lot of politics. I don't need to tell you folks that. And getting it right, being precise, using it as a way of structuring your thinking is really indispensable. And I think I really benefited from trying to do that in a semi-systematic way. And I'm looking forward to taking some GIS classes and getting my training wheels, as it were. So let me share one of our maps, and get a sense of sort of what we're looking at here I'll tick through just the basic themes that we look at and trying to represent with maps. And the thing to understand about the law of the sea, I won't get you unless people have specific questions about it. I won't go into any depth in it, other than to say that the law of the sea assigns rights and jurisdiction to states based on geography. That's the basic rule, and it's developed over time and has become much more geographically based over time, especially since the Law of the Sea Convention, which was concluded in 1982 and came into force just in 1994. So we're sort of in the throes of this really major flux in how much control states are able to exercise at sea. And it's a three-dimensional question too. It's not just the surface of the water, it's the subsurface, it's the airspace. And spatial thinking is really necessary to make sense of it. So what the book does is it looks at the ways that China, in particular, mainland China, puts its own vision of what the law of the sea is into practice with regard to 4 different sets of rules that are contained within the law of the sea. And these are all very pointed disputes, maritime disputes that you hear a lot about, and may be forgiven for thinking that they're just about ownership of islands or sovereignty of islands. But actually, those are kind of less interesting and less substantive disputes in a way. There's lots of territorial disputes. We understand what those are. They obviously can produce conflict and are to be taken seriously. But the interesting thing that they produce is, because the law of the sea is this geographically based system, is that ownership, title, sovereignty over islands can potentially generate huge areas of geographic space that are under state rights and jurisdiction, not their full sovereignty, which is an important thing to recognize when you look at this very, I think on its face, difficult to parse map. But basically what you see are the projected or hypothetical or provisional areas in which China claims to exercise certain resource rights, certain rights over navigation, certain rights over all manner of activities within and beneath and above maritime space. So this map in particular is the one that we use to think about the boundary and entitlement issues. And these are kind of a linked set of categories. Boundaries, I think, is intuitive. It's, you know, what's the line between one state's jurisdiction and another's. Entitlements are really the kind of crux of the geographic issue. It's this idea that land is entitled to a certain geographic space of rights and jurisdiction. And so what we see here, I guess, starting from the south and moving up to the north, you know, way down at the bottom of the South China Sea there, you see the tip of Borneo there, that's Malaysia, that's Brunei, Indonesia's just out of frame. What we have is these projected and very loosely defined Chinese zones. The most notorious of them is that 9-dash line, which is the long lines there that are kind of very, very widely spaced out. And they express some general idea of the scope of authority that China is claiming in this area. But there's sort of a layering on top of that. That is not the exclusive claim that they're laying out. They also have claims to the geographically based zones that might well project from all these little features, islands, rocks, reefs, shoals, underwater seabed type reefs and other features that themselves may conceivably, in China's version of the law of the sea, be projecting rights, be projecting coastal state authority. And so that's what you see in this cluster in the bottom right called the Nansha Archipelago. These are the Spratlys. There's another archipelago in the middle, the Zhongsha Archipelago, then the Xisha Archipelago, Dongsha Archipelago. These are the four big claims down there in the South China Sea, and each of them is supposed to generate some geographic effect, and we've tried to capture that in maps. And all these dotted lines and that you see there are essentially, these are provisional boundaries. And if you were to draw in the provisional boundaries and claims from other states, it would be even more difficult to parse. But basically what you'd see is that they're all overlapping, and it's very difficult for any of the other coastal states to have any maritime rights or jurisdiction if the Chinese claim is fully realized. As we move further north up, past Taiwan and into the East China Sea there, where China has disputes with both Koreas and Japan, it's a little bit more of an open space in the sense that you don't have this one really extraordinary claim, that 9-dash line, but you still see basically China using the fullest possible effect, geographic effect from all of its claims. Central to those are the Diaoyu Islands there in the middle. Those are disputed with Japan, so it's not even clear in which direction and for whom those islands would create any maritime jurisdiction. But you also see in this area another geographic expression of China's law of the sea, and that's at the Okinawa Trough there, just off the southern tip of the main Japanese islands. You see a PRC extended continental shelf claim, and the idea there is that states under one interpretation of the law of the sea may claim all the seabed out to the natural extension of their territory. And so this actually is a line determined by detailed hydrographic and geomorphological studies of what does the seabed look like. And it's this idea that the Okinawa Trough there, which actually runs considerably further down to the south, is the natural boundary, the geographic boundary between the landmass of Asia and the archipelago of Japan. And this has its own kind of profound effects, as you can see, on how much space China would get vis-a-vis Japan. You'd see a very truncated entitlement from Japan with respect to China. In the Yellow Sea, similarly, you see the natural extension of what China claims to be its land territory. It's the silt line, where particularly the Yellow River runs out into the Yellow Sea. And its silt is deposited in the seabed. And it's this idea that China's sort of rights and its control over land territory ought to extend out there. And so let's see if I can switch to the next one. Bear with me here, and let me know how I'm doing on time. I'm happy to wrap up and take questions if we're already breaking the budget.
Are you doing good? Yeah, a few more minutes.
Sure. Okay. Well, let me show you. I'll show you the other two maps here quickly. They have, oh, sorry. There we go. That should be clear. So this map is the one that we used to talk about resource claims. So within those boundaries that we're looking at last time, which are mostly still represented here, one of the things that they entail for the state that claims them is sovereign rights over the resources in the seabed, in the water column, so in fish mainly, and some amount of control over what goes on in the airspace, to the extent that that airspace could potentially interfere with the economic exploitation in those zones. And what we see here, one thing that I think probably stands out when you look at this, is that 12-degree north latitude line cutting across the South China Sea. There's no boundary there per se, but in the way that China seeks to enforce its claims, that's been a really meaningful cutoff. Below that is that Spratly Island group, the Nansha Archipelago, that is occupied by many different states, especially China, whose big island bases that you may have seen some of Paul's work, as well as just on the front page of the New York Times type stuff. These huge bases that have been built out of reclaimed land and dredged up coral down there in the South China Sea, at Mischief Reef, at Fiery Cross Reef, and at Subi Reef. And we see those as sort of a platform from which China is trying to assert, among other things, some claims to resources down in this very distant southern tier of the South China Sea. It's not so distant anymore. The one way to think about creating those bases is just really effectively territorializing that space for China. Now it's not a long sail from the mainland to send out fisheries law enforcement, or to send out a seismic survey vessel, or to send out the Navy or the Coast Guard for that matter. But it's local. Fiery Cross Reef, in particular, there in the Southwest, has been the main operational hub for a lot of the funny stuff that we see going down in the South China Sea, with clashes with Chinese fishermen, clashes with foreign survey vessels, etc. We also see a limited number of the oil blocks that China's tendered out for bid there on the west side of the South China Sea, and we see a handful of the major gas fields and oil fields that have been in contention. So yet another way of, kind of putting our thinking in space, and trying to understand what are the practical implications, what are the economic implications in this case of China realizing a particular claim. And I'll jump to the last one, which is a third set of rules that have been a big issue in China's maritime disputes, and these are the ones that touch most closely on U.S. interests in Asia and U.S. national security discourse that I imagine you're all exposed to one way or another by virtue of being in and around D.C. And this is a little bit like the inverse of the geographic claims, which is to say, given that a state can claim rights and claim jurisdiction and claim some type of authority and control over maritime space through the law of the sea, what are the rights and interests and freedoms, as it were, of other states that want to operate in this space? Prior to the Law of the Sea Convention in 1992, all that a coastal state, China or any other coastal state, would control was the Territorial Sea. And what that is, you can take a look at the top thing on the legend, but it's that double line just surrounding the Chinese coastline. They put some double lines around the Shisha Archipelago and just off the south coast.
Isaac, are you trying to show us the map?
Oh yeah, is that not up for you? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think this one's not showing up for some reason.
My mistake.
There we go.
it
Now I
is.
see it.
Thank you for letting me know. That's useful. Can you still see it?
Yep.
Good. So, you know, it's substantively similar. There's a couple other components in this that show the nature of China's claims to regulate navigation. But basically what we're looking at is, you know, what are the Chinese supposed rules in this space for the navigation of foreign vessels, and particularly military vessels? This is where it really comes to a head. So just to foot stomp again on that Territorial Sea. So you're looking at it, it's those double lines running just along the coastline there of China, as well as two sets of them over little islands. But prior to the 1990s, that was the full extent of any coastal state's sort of legally recognized authority to regulate the navigation of other states. Now with these huge new zones, the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf in particular, those are those ones that really are projected far out from the coastline. There's a debate, there's a dispute about just how much of the high seas freedoms, the freedom of the sea is sustained, is preserved after imposing all these geographic rules on it. And so we flagged a couple of the key incidents between the Chinese and the US Navy with little stars. We talk a lot about what's going on in the Taiwan Strait, which is conceivably part of China's, or almost necessarily part of China's exclusive economic zone, which, as the name implies, is an economic zone. But China reads in a variety of different ways that the coastal state ought to be able to control navigation, military navigation. So why don't I wrap it up here with I'll make a last pitch for Andy Rhodes, who I think would have a lot of interesting things to say to you guys about thinking in space, role of geography and national security decision making, and be happy to answer any questions that folks have on the project. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Isaac. There were a couple questions that came in the chat related to data. So John wanted to know if you could explain where the source of the various boundary lines come from, and also if there's any open source bathymetry data for the disputed areas that you're aware of.
Yeah, so Paul may be able to help with the original origins of the sources. I drew from a bunch of different sources, including the data that they've developed at the CSIS think tank, the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative that Greg Poling runs. And what they did there is basically just created shape files out of the formal claims that China's issued, as well as projected the 200 nautical mile zones that are implied in China's law, or are prescribed rather in China's law about what they should claim. The other data points in there, and the other geospatial data that made it in there, comes from a really wide variety of sources, from industry sources when it comes to oil and gas and fisheries, from formal submissions to the United Nations when it comes to things like the extended continental shelf and baselines, which are formally declared, and things like the Air Defense Identification Zone, which are announced by the Chinese Ministry of National Defense. And let's see, yeah, I think that basically openly available geospatial data that comes from formal submissions, as well as using some inferences to project the extent of zones that China has claimed formally in its laws. So it requires a little analysis and then synthesis of those data to try and make sense of it geographically. But that is the basic set of sources. Does that answer the question?
I hope so. Oh, good. Yeah, he says yes.
Great.
we have time? We have time for one more question. If somebody would like to throw one out.
Hey, Isaac, could I share my screen for 1 second?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to, here we go. It's all yours.
This is a picture for
Oh,
what
cool.
you were talking about. That's what they did. The Chinese did in 5 years at Fiery Cross
Yeah.
Reef. They went from a reef underwater to a military base.
Yeah, Eddie, thank you for sharing that. And I neglected to mention Maxar imagery is some of the best stuff out there, and I've spent a lot of time looking at your imagery. So thank you for providing that service. And it tells the story better than the 150,000 words of text in this book manuscript in a lot of ways. And so I'm glad you threw that.
I had that from another conference, and I thought it would be worth seeing.
Yeah, no, I think that imagery is really it's a unique contribution to the politics of the issue too. You'd never had anything like this before, where, I mean, I guess I would say not quite in real time. The stuff that people started paying attention to was after the fact, but despite that, it created this really visually arresting, tangible, immediately understandable story about what's going on out there. And those are not trivial bases. The whole U.S. facility at Pearl Harbor fits in the harbor of those 3 big bases down in the South China Sea. They are not nothing.
Wow.
So yeah, thank you, Eddie. And I think if my book publisher would allow color images at high resolution, I would be including those in there too. maybe an option for the cover using one of those beautiful shots from overhead satellites. But
Or for the ebook.
Or for the ebook, that's right. But Paul, within the constraints of black and white, no shades, was able to put together, I think, a really, particularly if you read the book along with it, it's a great way to make sense spatially of what the substantive discussion is about.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Isaac. I appreciate you sharing your expertise with us on this. It's a really interesting talk. I think we had Greg Polling last year.
Oh, good. You should definitely have Greg if you haven't.
Yeah, I think he was here last year, if I'm recalling correctly. I might have missed that one though.
No, we did.
Yeah.
Greg is a great champion of the geographic arts in the national security field. I'm glad you guys have had him.
So awesome. Thank you very much.